Hi there, Joshua Hanlon here, and today I'm outside at the 1st Division Museum in Cantigny Park, Illinois, and I'm joined by Matt. He is going to be taking us through their tank timeline that they have outdoors here. So it's kind of like moving through history with a number of different tanks from World War I all the way to modern day, and you'll get to see how tanks have changed and evolved over the years. So right off the bat here, why don't you tell us about this one we're standing next to?
Well, this one right here is it's a very rare tank. This is an M1917. So this is a licensed copy of the Renault FT17, which is a French tank from World War I. These tanks were built with either a 30 cal machine gun or a 37 millimeter anti-bunker main gun. So a neat thing about it is that this is considered the first modern tank. It has crew up front, it has the engine in the back, and you have a driver, a gunner, as well as a fully rotating turret. Now the neat thing is that the commander of the tank, who's also the gunner, he's actually going to communicate with the driver by kicking him in the back. He will kick him with his right leg into the right shoulder to have him pull the brake on the right track to turn right, and vice versa for the left track. And we actually have a volunteer on staff who was a tanker, and he says that that would not fly with modern tankers. Now, an interesting thing about it is that it's about 7 tons. And this tank actually also has somewhat of a connection with the 1st Division and the park in general. George Patton, who played polo with Colonel McCormick here at Cantigny, he actually commanded tanks like this during World War I. So you have the 1st Tank Brigade in the U.S. Army, and they provide tank infantry support to the 1st Division in the Battle of St. Mihiel, which is a very important battle. So otherwise, this tank right here is actually marked up with historic markings, such as the 1st Tank Company. That is one of the units attached to the 1st Tank Brigade. So otherwise, it's a pretty simple tank. It's bare bones.
You can see how it was kind of the early years of tank evolution, and they were still figuring things out and kind of getting to what we think of as kind of the classic tank look today.
Yes, indeed. So actually the tracks, for example, this is one of the first tanks that has tracks that go the entire length of the vehicle. A lot of the early tanks actually had tracks that would only go about 2/3 at most. So this is considered the best design that the French came up with during World War I. In fact, they actually would use the FT's main armor and even sometimes the same turret on some of their later designs in the years between World War I and World War II. So it's a very neat tank, in all honesty. And I'll actually point out one other thing. You can tell that it is very rudimentary because this is actually how you're going to see outside the tank for the driver. It's just very small cuts in the armor plating.
Extremely limited vision there.
Yes, not the best vision, but you're going to definitely be able to see where you're going. And the armor plating is going to provide enough protection from your basic dangers during World War I, such as shrapnel from artillery shells or machine gun fire. So this is the M5 Stuart. So the reason why it's called the M5 Stuart is the British actually named tanks after American Civil War generals. So this is named after General Stuart, who was in the Confederate Army. Other tanks that were named after U.S. generals were the Grant/Lee for the M3 medium tank. You also have the M4 Sherman. The U.S. actually adopts these names in 1943 and 44. So the M5 is what we're kind of using as one of our main tanks starting in early World War II. The neat thing about it is that it's armed with another 37 millimeter gun, but this is a much longer barrel. It's also meant to fight the early German tanks. Once we're fighting the German tanks, such as the later model Panzer IIIs and IVs, those have thicker armor. So this is going to have a lot more trouble. So we're going to start relying on larger tank guns, such as the 75 millimeter. Now the neat thing is this is a 4-man tank crew. You have a driver who's going to be sitting on the left side of the front right here in the hull, and then you have the battle machine gunner who's going to be sitting right here. The battle machine gunner's job is probably the most simple because his job is to really just make sure that nobody's going to be surprising the tank in front. They are actually switching to a new system of sights. You're going to be using a periscope sight, which is right up here on the hatches. That's going to basically work like your standard periscope that I'm sure many people have used in the past, and that's going to provide great visibility for U.S. tanks. A thing to know about U.S. tanks in World War II especially is they actually had better visibility out of the tank than other countries' tanks. The Russians were probably the worst in all reality, and one thing that we made sure was that our tanks had excellent periscope sights. So another thing I'll know about the Stuart is that cool thing about it is it has an automatic transmission. So long before cars really had automatic transmissions, we were actually putting them into tanks. And the transmission is going to be housed right up here. Meanwhile, the engine's going to be in the back. So the way that a tank's transmission and engine work is that they're going to drive what's known as the sprocket right here. And these have teeth. They're going to hook into the tracks like this, and it's going to move the whole track. Meanwhile, at the back, you're going to have what's known as the idler wheel. The idler wheel basically keeps the tracks under tension so that it functions properly. And another neat thing about the Stuart is that it has two Cadillac V8 engines. They're going to produce about over 400 horsepower when combined, and they actually use a special system so that way both engines are running and able to work as one engine in order to propel the tank. The one that we have in the collection that actually runs was built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1942. I've ridden in it, and it is very fast, and it is quite a fun thing to experience.
What would you say comfort-wise on that to give people an idea of what that experience was like? Was it pretty bare bones inside there?
Actually, American tanks are really nice. If you wanted to know bare bones, that's a Soviet T-34, but American tanks had they had cushions on the seats for the crews. The suspension actually dampens a lot of the shocks and bumps. I would not suggest driving over a rough course at full speed in this. You will probably be a little bruised at the end. But if you're going under 20 miles per hour, you're not going to really feel a whole lot. But when it does turn very sharply, because this is also, it's using a very similar system to what that M1917 was. It's using tillers, which again, just pull it back on the right side, it locks the right track, and you turn right, and vice versa for the left.
We're moving through World War II history now, and we've come to a couple of tanks that are pretty close in the exhibit here. So which one is this next to us?
So this is the M24 Chaffee. This is going to be our next version of the light tank in World War II. We learned a lot of lessons using the Stuart, and we kind of realized that we need a bigger main gun. So we strap onto it the M6 75mm main gun. It's actually designed for aircraft, but we decided that it works good for light tanks. It's going to be very similar to what the early Shermans are using. Now, the neat thing about the Chaffee is that we realized that there's some things about the Stuart that work perfect. So we're actually going to use the same engine and the same transmission in the Chaffee that we use in the Stuart, because don't break what's not broken, right? Or don't fix what's not broken.
Right.
The neat thing about the Chaffee is that it's also a 5-man crew. So you have 5 men that are packed into this vehicle. And unlike most American tanks, the gunner actually sits on the left side instead of the right. So he's going to be sitting over the driver. So it's very similar to what the Germans are using in World War II. Now, another thing I'll point out with the Chaffee is that it also uses a new type of suspension. This is called torsion bar. It's actually the same type of suspension that all modern tanks use. So this is one of our first vehicles that we're using it on. They actually have to tell American GIs, give them a little education on that. This does not mean it's a German tank that has this suspension, because this is what the Germans are using earlier on. So another thing is that we're still having the transmission in the front and the engine in the back. We're going to switch over after World War II to having the engines in the back and along with the transmissions. Now, it's named after Admiral Chaffee, who was head of Armored Force prior to World War II. He died suddenly in 1941, and he was a big proponent of mobile armored warfare. So they thought it was very fitting to name the Chaffee after him, because it's meant to act as an armored reconnaissance vehicle, maneuver around the enemy, and provide fire support for the infantry. And these would actually be some of the first tanks that would see combat in Korea. The 1st Division was not in Korea. It was stationed in Germany during the Korean War, but the first American tank units to see combat in Korea, a lot of them were using M24 Chafees against Soviet-built T-34s.
This tank has an interesting turret design as well. So there's kind of the classic, more rounded look that a lot of people think of with tanks, but this kind of has this whole section sticking out the back here. So what's some of the reasons for that type of a design?
So we're making a lot of decisions with designing tank turrets and whatnot. So one thing that we learned is actually you want to make sure there's plenty of space inside the tank. So one way you can do that is you can do what's called a bustle on the back of the turret. So that's going to hold your radio for the commander to be able to operate. Earlier tanks for the British, the Germans, and the Americans often are going to have the radio, a radio man or the radio stored down in the hull, but it's actually often moved up to the turrets later on in the war. The Sherman Firefly, which is the famous British modification of the Sherman with the 17-pounder, that actually made it so that the radio couldn't fit in the tank, that modification. So they actually cut a hole in the back of the turret and weld on an armored box holding the radio. So it's a very similar thing to what we're doing with the Chaffee. And the later Shermans, they'll have bustles built in for the radios. And on the back of the bustle, you actually see an extra storage box. So that's going to be how troops are going to store their personal items, such as blankets, sleeping bags, sometimes extra food and rations. There were some modifications made to some Shermans in World War II that would be like that, but they are actually often used for ammunition for like the 50 cal on top. So there is some changes in the design of the turret, but there's also some things that are being kept on, such as the pistol port. This was not actually used for firing pistols at the enemy. It's actually used mainly by crews to load shells into the turret, because it's a lot easier than loading it through the top of the tank.
Fantastic, and as we walk over to the next tank here, I wanted to ask you about something you touched on there, and that's kind of the idea of personal objects that the troops had. So if you can, give us a little an overview of kind of what the life was like for the troops serving in these tanks. Where did they do things like spend the night? You know, how was the tank stored? What was some of that? Kind of, I guess, the stuff that's not as flashy, maybe.
That's a good way to put it. So being a tanker is a bit of a different job than regular infantrymen or someone who's serving in the rear areas. You are responsible for taking care of the vehicle. You're also, a lot of times this is actually considered home by a lot of the tankers. Tankers also take a lot of pride in their specific vehicle. They'll name it, they'll paint it, they will keep track of it and make sure that it's all in working order. Now, personal items can often be such as sleeping bags or blankets, extra food and rations, anything that they don't want to keep inside the tank themselves. I will say being inside in the interior of the tank is much safer for a personal item. Basically anything that you can afford to lose if it happens to be hit by machine gun fire or an anti-tank shell, that's going to be put in the back storage areas on the turret, whereas things you don't want to lose track of are going to be kept inside. Tankers actually are oftentimes given equipment that's a little different than the average infantry. For example, in World War II, they were given much better jackets. Not necessarily that they were giving the infantry bad stuff, but they were giving tankers stuff that was a little bit newer design, a little simpler, and a lot less bulky. So they were really trying to make it so that their equipment would be conducive to fighting inside the tank. Now, actually, fun fact about those tanker jackets, infantrymen would oftentimes try to get a hold of them during the Battle of the Bulge. They were a very popular commodity to come across. And the term tank top, there's some theories that the tankers actually were the ones that created it, because you're not going to wear that heavy tanker jacket in the summer because it does get hot. We actually don't have air conditioning and heating inside the tanks until a little later on. They started introducing the heating units first. So they would have to oftentimes be in t-shirts or tank tops in order to make it inside the tank, and they would keep the hatches open in order for a little bit of air cooling.
Fascinating. So what can you tell us about this tank model then?
So this is the M41 Walker Bulldog. This tank right here is actually it's a very neat tank. One of the reasons why is that the U.S. never uses it in combat. It's used by
not what you typically expect with a tank.
The U.S. actually, we supplied a lot of these to our ally South Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and the South Vietnamese were actually able to use it very effectively against the communist enemy. And basically, it was very effective. It's designed to be a little bit of a combination of a light tank and a little bit of the technology from medium tanks. So we're moving from a 75mm main gun to a 76. We're also going to slim down to a 4-man crew. We're getting rid of the bow machine gunner. And that's because we're realizing that with armor for tanks is that the bow machine gun's a weak spot. So we're going to delete the bow machine gun and actually use the space where it would be to store ammunition for the main gun. So the driver's going to be here on the left, and he's also going to be using those vision periscopes in order to see out of the tank. You're also going to have a slightly more armor on this. It is a light tank still, but it has if I remember correctly, it's about 1.5 inches of frontal armor. So that's going to be able to protect you against a lot of the Soviet autocannons that you're going to be fighting. This is not going to protect you against an enemy anti-tank gun. So something like that would be on T-54 or T-55. That will go right through this, but it'll survive a 23 or 30mm anti-tank cannon that's being mounted on a lot of the Soviet IFVs. And another thing to know is actually that we're going to actually be having a lot of the car manufacturers building a lot of these tanks. That's something that many people don't realize. The Chaffee, for example, was built using Cadillac engines. The M4 Sherman was built using parts from both Ford, GM, and Chrysler as well. Chrysler actually built the most tanks out of all the companies during World War II. In fact, the company that created the Sherman, they were actually the designers of the M1 Abrams, and we'll get into that a little later. But another neat thing about the Walker Bulldog, it's actually named after General Walker. General Walker was killed in a Jeep accident in Korea, but he was another big proponent of armored warfare, so they named the tank after him. By this time, we're actually starting to name tanks after generals because it's a tradition that we're really adopting, even though it was of British origin. Now, another thing I'll note is that a neat thing about these tanks is that when they were moving the Declaration of Independence and Constitution from the Library of Congress to the National Archives, they actually used 2 of these to provide an armored escort in Washington, D.C. So there's a great picture. I forget where I saw it, but it's basically a couple of Marines and soldiers and sailors armed with M1 Thompsons walking up the steps into the building, and in the back you just see these 2 tanks. So we took those documents very seriously back then, and these were the lightest things we had in inventory, so we couldn't send the heavier stuff because they would have torn up the roads. But that's just a cool fact about the Walker Bulldog. But one thing I'll point out, actually, you'll notice how I point out the sprocket on the earlier tanks. You can see it's actually not in the front anymore, it's in the back. We moved the transmission to the back with the engine, and that's what's known as a power pack. So it's going to be a much more simple system. It's actually what the Soviets are using in some of their tanks early in World War II. We adopt it with the M26 Pershing, and we stick with it all the way through to modern day. And it actually makes it so that you can take the transmission and the engine out as one piece. And that's really important for U.S. tank doctrine, is ease of repairs and being able to do stuff in the field if necessary.
Is that something that improves going back to that first World War I tank we saw through kind of World War II and the Cold War? Is there kind of a push behind the scenes in the tank design to always improve things like that and just make it simpler for troops in the field to maintain these? Because obviously there are so many things I'm sure that can go wrong with a vehicle like this.
Well, tanks they're armored vehicles that oftentimes weigh tens, if not multiple tons. They're going to be weighing the most modern tanks are going to be weighing about 60 to 70 tons for the Western versions. Your Soviet/Russian tanks, they're going to be weighing about 40 to 50. So there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. The United States tanks have always been pushing for as simple as possible, the most simplicity. So a perfect example is the M4 Sherman had about half as many moving parts as the Tiger tank during World War II. So there's far less things to go wrong. Our tanks are also they were designed to be as easy to fix as possible. So we're going to make it so that the parts are as reliable as possible. There's one story I heard, I don't know how true it is, but there's this one washer in the Sherman that supposedly was breaking before everything else. They had the washer redesigned so that you wouldn't have a problem from just a small little piece. You'd rather have the transmission break than a small little thing break because, well, if you're stopping because of a small little thing, that's not really a good thing. And a perfect example is in World War II, they would actually do regular maintenance on the tanks after several 100-mile intervals. So the engine was every 200 miles and the transmission was every 400 miles. And that's how we were able to keep our tanks in tip-top shape. A huge difference between us and the Germans is that the Germans would oftentimes be at only about 50% strength for their combat units for tanks. We would always be at 100% strength. And then one of the reasons is we could always replace tanks. We were producing enough to replace them, but it's also the fact that we can do the maintenance on them very simply, very easily, and very quickly. You can change a Sherman's engine or transmission within a couple of hours in the field. So that's one thing that we've always tried to keep on. All the way from World War I, we're just learning how to work the tanks, how to really take care of them and how to make them work as best as possible, all the way through where we're switching things around to where the transmission's in the back too, so we can just pull it out as one piece. And even into the modern day where we're now introducing electronic systems that can actually monitor everything about the tank. So it can tell you, hey, the oil needs to be changed. The tracks need to be retensioned. The engine is sucking in too much sand and you need to change the air filters. We can really kind of make sure that these things are able to run for hundreds and hundreds of miles if necessary. But in the meantime, we're still going to do the maintenance on them to make it so that they're always ready to go at a moment's notice.
There we go. We'll keep moving down the line then.
All right, so this right here is the T26E4, and if I had to pick favorites in the tank park, this is probably it. There's maybe one or two others that I really like as well, but this one is very special. This is actually one of 25 tanks that were built. It's a special prototype of the M26 Pershing. So the T26, that means that it's in the prototype phase. That's the case with a lot of weapons and technology before the Army switches to using X as the letter that they use to stand for experimental. And oftentimes they'll actually use XM to stand for the prototype. So the T26 means it's an M26 Pershing prototype. And the E4 means that it has this really large 90mm gun. So in World War II, the larger caliber gun, the better. Most of the tanks in World War II are going to be using what's known as a 75mm or 76mm. It's not necessarily the width of the shell, it's going to also be the length of the barrel. So the 90mm on this Pershing right here is going to be the T15 E2. So that means it's going to be using this very long barrel. It's capable of producing very high velocities for the tank shells, and it's also going to be using two-piece ammunition. So the shell is going to be one piece. You put that in the breech of the gun, and then you're going to load the propellant, which is in its own casing. So it's actually very much like an artillery howitzer. Another thing to know is that this is going to be part of a program that we're trying to really one-up the Germans and the Soviets, because the Germans are producing the Tiger II, they're producing the Panther, they're producing the Jagdtiger, which are very heavy machines. We can destroy the Panthers very easily with the M3 90mm, which the regular Pershings have. The 76mm gun on the late war Shermans are also capable of destroying the Panthers easily. But the Tiger II, we don't really have something that's capable of facing it a head-on fight. So we're developing tanks like this. Now, the predecessor to this, there's actually two field modifications for the T26E4. They're technically the T26E1s, and those are actually going to be done in the field by troops in the 3rd Armored Division. So that is going to be, that's the famous Super Pershing, which many people look up online. It's oftentimes represented in video games. It has a bunch of extra armor welded onto the front of it and whatnot, but that's the same gun that this has actually.
But that was something that troops themselves kind of took upon themselves and were like, hey, we're going to modify this and just kind of improve the equipment we have?
So it's a little bit of that. So the Army in World War II, it's very interesting. It's not 100% rigid. It's actually going to be getting a lot of feedback and input from the troops themselves. For example, they ship over the 90mm guns, the large 90mm, and I don't know the exact thought process behind creating those field-made prototypes, but the extra armor plating that they put on, that is in a sense what the troops decide, because they feel that the stock armor plate is not going to be enough by itself. So they actually cut the armor plate off the front of a Panther tank and they welded to the turret, because it's 80mm thick of steel. In all honesty, the Panther's armor is not the best to pick from, but it's what they had available. But the neat thing is that they also had to put a counterweight on the back of the turrets. So the counterweight is on the back of the turrets right here, and the reason it's on there is because the main gun is so heavy, it's so long, that it actually causes the Pershing's body, the hull, to actually lean forward so a couple of degrees. So it's actually going to put some stress and tension on the front of the transmission. You can kind of see a little bit how it's kind of leaning forward a little bit. But the counterweight's in order to balance in the turret properly. And another thing that they realize with this prototype is that they really actually need a heavy tank that can hold the main gun properly without modifications. So they work on the T-32 prototype, starting with the mock-ups and the original design in middle of 45 actually. So the T-26E4, they do ship about 25 of them. They produce them by the end of the war, and they ship them out to Europe, and they are going to arrive in Europe literally right before the end of the war, about late April. Now, this is the last one of its kind, and the reason why is that after the war, the Army takes a look at all the programs that it's working on. So fun things such as the automatic M1 Garand, they get cut from the budget, and the T-26 program is one of them. They already have the standard Pershing with the 90mm, it's a good enough tank, it has a good enough gun, and they don't really see the need for having a Pershing that has a large 90 millimeter gun. They're already working on those heavy tank designs that are using that main gun. So they decide that they're going to either scrap them or use them for target practice for other tanks. So that's actually what happened with the other 24 of this version. And I don't know exactly 100% how this got here, but I can kind of give you a little bit of a hint. When we were creating the tank park, the museum, we probably were calling around to figure out, are there tanks available? Who has a tank that they can give us? Is there a tank someone's willing to, give to a museum? And someone probably somewhere knew about this. It was either on a firing range or in a depot or set to be scrapped or something, and they realized, hey, this is neat, they might like this. So eventually it gets shipped out to here and has been here ever since. And quite frankly, that's amazing, because this is literally the last of the M26 prototypes. They scrapped all the other different prototypes they were working on.
That's incredible, and that's something that I think is so amazing about the whole museum itself, and military museums like this, is the work that's done not only to kind of educate and display objects to people, but also just preserve some really unique stuff, one-of-a-kind type things from different eras here. So that's a really amazing story. That's fantastic. And this is very unique looking. That the size of that barrel definitely stands out as you're walking around and kind of looking at these different tanks here.
Yeah, they don't make tank guns that big anymore. They're typically a lot smaller. And but back then, if you need to penetrate more armor, you made a bigger gun.
Now there's a couple more in this section that we wanted to touch on as well. This one in the middle certainly stands out for its design reasons, and you've got this fantastic kind of color tiger scheme here. So talk a little bit about kind of tank design painting. I know you mentioned earlier that troops would sometimes paint their tanks, so how common was something like this in combat?
So this is not very common in combat. This is actually specifically from the Korean War, this kind of paint style. First, I'll tell you which tank it is. It's an M46 Patton, so this is the first tank named after General George Patton. This is basically a product improved version of the M26 Pershing. New engine, new gun. A lot of the things are the same. And these are going to be used in Korea. We're going to produce a little over 1,000 of them. And it's a very good tank. This is better than anything the North Korean or the Chinese armies are going to be using. It's got a 90 millimeter main gun. It's also going to be having the same amount of armor as the M26 Pershing. But this paint job is very unique to Korean War, because one of the things that soldiers do is they oftentimes try to find any psychological edge they can over their opponents. So a perfect example is that in World War II, American GIs would often call the Germans Krauts, which is short for sauerkraut. The Army Air Corps would actually paint the shark mouth and teeth and eyes on the front of P-40s and other planes in the Pacific, because in Japanese culture, sharks were kind of considered, to not be on the best terms with people. So this is actually another example of that. So in China, we were fighting China at the time during the Korean War, and part of the Chinese zodiac is the tiger. So someone decided that, hey, this seems like something that would be a potential psychological edge, and they painted the tanks to resemble tigers or other creatures. And very quickly they figured out that no, we don't actually know what we're talking about, and it actually just makes the tank much easier to spot. So it's basically, as I like to kind of joke about the French uniform from World War I, the first one they use is bright red hat, a bright red pants, and a bright blue shirt. That uniform basically says, "Shoot me, I'm right here," to use a little cruder terms, but that's in a sense what this paint job in a sense is kind of doing. It's telegraphing your position. It's showing everyone where you are. And tanks are typically painted in a solid base color or a camouflage pattern that helps it blend in. So very quickly, the tiger patterns were done away with by the units in the field. We have it painted like this actually because both the history behind the practice, but also the fact that this tank is actually known as the Tigers because it was painted by the museum staff, and most of the staff at the time were women, so that's why we know as the Tigress. But another quick thing about the M46 is that this is actually going to be this is going to be kind of the standard that we use. We're going to actually use some of our first high explosive anti-tank rounds. So that's basically using explosions to make a liquid penetrator to go through tank armor. So It's also going to be at when we're really starting to get into the real science of, armored warfare with different shells and different types of tank guns and really kind of experimenting a lot.
Beyond just kind of throwing the biggest projectile possible at the enemy type of idea, and you're really kind of, starting to bring more of that technological side into the battlefield.
Yeah, so in World War II is just basically the base example. You have three types of shells. You have smoke, you have armor piercing, and you have high explosive. High explosive just explodes on contact. Smoke obviously produces smoke, but then you have multiple types of armor piercing. You have armor piercing high explosive, which means it blows up when it penetrates, after it penetrates through the armor. You have armor piercing rounds that are more like the modern rounds, which are called saber rounds. What we're using is called high velocity armor piercing. It's shortened to HVAP. That's basically going to be a small, dense dart surrounded by a body of less dense material, oftentimes it's steel or aluminum. But then also you're going to have rounds such as the discarding sabot or whatnot. That's going to be a British invention. This is going to be using another round that we developed in World War II actually for the bazooka. High explosive anti-tank. It's going to create a jet of liquid copper typically, and that's going to be able to go through the steel of a tank's armor. It's going to be what's known as a shaped charge because inside the metal is going to be arranged in a cone in front of the explosives. So like I said, we're really changing, like you said actually, we're really changing from from throwing a hard piece of metal at another hard piece of metal and really coming up with having a more dense piece of metal going through a less dense metal, or having a chemical reaction to create a liquid metal to go through the metal. So this is one of the tanks that we're really starting to use that a lot more.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at that history, and we have one more tank now in this section. So which one is this?
This is the M47 Patton. You're noticing a theme, I'm guessing, by now. So Patton was that influential on armored warfare that we're going to name several tanks after him. There's going to be a total of 4 Patton tanks. The M47 is going to see a lot more production. We're going to have about 9,000 of these built. And actually, a fun fact, one of the modern tanks that, well, not quite modern, but the more recent tanks that the country of Iran uses is going to be based on the hull of the M47. Because we provide a lot of these to our allies during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's going to also be armed with a 90mm gun. A lot of countries will upgrade them to a 105mm later in time. But this tank also has some new upgrades to it. So you're going to notice the armor looks a lot different. It's not just a simple wedge shape or flat plane. It's actually also going to be shaped and curved a little bit. The turret is of a different design. It's not going to be that kind of a cylinder or can looking design. It's actually going to be shaped in order to provide as much thickness for the armor, because when a tank shell hits a slope, it's actually going to have less penetration than if it's hitting a flat object. So a perfect example is the Tiger 1 had almost perpendicular armor to the ground, so it made it very easy to go through because it's only going to be about 4 inches. The M4 Sherman had about 3.96 inches of armor actually, and its armor was sloped about 50 to 47 degrees typically. So when you slope the armor, even though it's thinner, it can actually have the same thickness as one that's perpendicular to the ground. So that's actually one thing that we learned in World War II. We actually learned it earlier on, but we implemented it on every tank in World War II. And we really start to experiment a little further with technology such as casting in World War II and then in the post-war era. Another thing is this is a different 90mm gun than the previous tanks. This gun is going to be a much more modern version. It's going to be a little better to use, and it's going to be using more modern shells. We're also going to couple it with a rangefinder system. So a lot tanks did not have rangefinders in many cases prior to the 1950s. Your most advanced tanks in World War II could have something like a rangefinder, but basically rangefinders are going to be another thing that we're actually going to implement in mass, because there's now 2 different sides of a conflict. You have the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and the US and NATO, as well as our allies. And there's 2 different philosophies for tank production during that time. You have the Soviet model, which is produce as many tanks as possible. Doesn't matter how quality they are. It just matters that we have more. And then you have the US/NATO philosophy, which is really actually going to be, we're going to have better tanks, they're going to be able to outrange the enemies, and they're going to be more mobile, they're going to be just better overall. And having a nice rangefinder like the M47 does is really going to play into that, because it's going to make it so that we can hit the enemy tanks at much longer range than they can hit us. They're also going to be moving very slowly because they're advancing in mass formations. If our tanks are able to shoot and scoot, as they say, they're going to be able to be much more effective. So we want to be able to hit the enemy tanks much farther away, and we want to be able to reposition our tanks in order to handle the massive amounts of enemy tanks that are being made. And the reason, and a perfect example of that philosophy is the Russians, the Soviets, they built about 100,000 T-54s and T-55s, those two models combined. So there's actually, there's still some that they still have in storage, and it's quite impressive that they built that many, but if it ever did come to it, I'm pretty sure I'd take the 9,000 of these over 20,000 of those.
There you go. That is fascinating. It's really interesting to hear about kind of different theories and approaches to specific tank design, and then kind of the larger kind of strategic approach to deploying tanks in the battlefield. And as we've walked around here, I've noticed obviously you have a lot of visitors to the park here, which is fantastic. And it looks like it's kind of open season with the tanks out here in terms of letting people climb on top of them and kind of interact with them. So what is the museum's kind of thought and approach to that?
Well, we don't actually, as far as I'm aware, have an official policy as to, you know, should people climb on them or not. It's growing up in the local area, I actually remember coming here as a kid and climbing on them myself. It's something that pretty much everyone likes to do. I've seen grown men climbing on top of the turrets, and a couple years ago I saw a couple of men, they were on top of the M60 over there, and one of them yells down to his wife and he says, "Honey, take a picture." So it's something that's just really fun. Obviously, if you're in the military, you're going to have to climb onto the tank to get into it. So it is a little bit of, I guess you could say, some interactive history, because people are able to actually experience what it's like to actually mount a tank, as they say. And a lot of museums, such as the one in Bovington, they obviously keep the things very, very pristine and whatnot. These are more of in what's known as a gate guardian position, so they're kept out in the elements. We make sure that they're taken care of well enough that nothing's really going to hurt them, and we do make sure that they're also sealed up, because there have been times where people try to get into tanks. We have not had an incident in a long time, so that's good to report. But honestly, people love it, and we actually get some vets that served in the Korean War and Vietnam War era, and they think it's neat that the kids like climbing on them. So this is the M48 pattern. This is going to be the next in the pattern line, and this is actually a rare example because this is a base model M48. So the neat thing is that there are actually not many of these that were made. One of the reasons is that it got very poor gas mileage. Many people nowadays probably consider 20 miles per gallon bad gas mileage. This did not get anywhere near that. It could go about 70 miles in total on a full tank of gas. In fact, they actually realized that we really need to do some changes to how we design tanks. And this is actually, the 48 patents are going to be the first tanks that get diesel engines in the United States Army. We're using gasoline up until this point. And the M48 patent is going to be a very successful design, especially after they get the new diesel engines. They're going to be used by our allies. They're going to be used by the United States in Vietnam. And in fact, actually, we're going to upgrade some of them in the early 80s to have 105 millimeter guns, which are going to be the same as the Abrams and the M60s. So I'll actually point out something. I did mention earlier how we're really kind of going into the idea of using different geometry for creating the tank armor. So this is actually a perfect example of us doing that with a curved armor plate. This is known as cast armor. So it's going to be very, very resistant to shells. You can very easily mold it to whatever shape you want. But there is one thing to know about, is that actually the M48 is not the only tank that we designed to have this type of armor, this plate specifically. We actually designed it to be a lot like the M103 heavy tanks. So I did mention how we developed tanks that have those larger guns. The M103 is going to basically be what is supposed to long range slug it out with Soviet tanks. This is going to be more of for everything else. So this is what we would call a main battle tank. And we're also seeing with the patents a new philosophy emerging. We're going to eventually stop using light tanks. We're going to eventually stop using the the heavy tanks. We're going to focus in on just one tank. It's really going to be derived from the medium tank line that started in World War II. So the 48 Patton also has 4-man crew. It's a little smaller than the 46 and the 47. It's going to have the driver in the front here of the tank, and you're going to have the commander, the loader, and the gunner all in the turret. Now the turret's also designed to be big enough that it can provide enough space for the crew inside in order to maneuver the shells around as well as do their jobs. And the turret ring is actually, in a sense, the determinant of how big the tank is. Perfect example, in World War II, we decided that all of our tanks that were going to be medium tanks and heavy tanks, a lot of them were going to have a 69-inch turret ring in diameter. So actually, we were able to take an M26 Pershing turret and put it onto an M4 Sherman hull for a prototype vehicle. It was never going to be sent overseas. They just wanted to see if they could do it. But that is actually what they were able to do. Another neat thing about the M48 is that it's designed to take advantage, again, of those shells that we're using and developing. It's going to be using HVAP, but at this point it's called Sabo. It's also going to be using heat shells. And we're also going to make it so that it's nice and heavy duty. For example, in Vietnam, they would actually use these for what were known as thunder runs. So the tracks are very well constructed, and the tank's very heavy. So it's perfect for setting off landmines at high speeds. So they would actually use the M48s and drive them down a road, 2 across, and they drive them at high speeds, so that ways the landmines that were potentially on the road would just explode behind them. A anti-vehicle mine is not really going to do much to a tank. You really need an anti-tank mine. If they have fears that there's going to be anti-tank mines, they're probably not going to do a thunder run. But the thunder runs were just meant to save a lot of time for the minesweepers, as well as just kind of, do something a little effective and a little fun at the same time. But another neat thing about this vehicle is that we actually supply a lot of M48s to Germany, as well as a little secretly we provide them to Israel. And Israel made great use of them during their wars against Syria and Egypt in the 60s and 70s. They were actually hitting tanks from a mile out with some of the M48s that we were providing them. So it's a very accurate system. It's the same philosophy as the M47, where we're designing it to be as long range as possible, as accurate as possible, and as well made as possible. So yeah, it's a good tank. And I'll actually point out one last thing. You can notice that this one has a nickname on it right here. This is Snoopy. So this is an example of tankers naming their tanks and sometimes giving a little character to go along with it. So this is the M551 Sheridan. This is technically not a tank, actually. It's actually supposed to be an airdropped vehicle, and it's designed for cavalry units as well as paratrooper units. So it's designed to give those units a bit of tank support when they normally wouldn't. Now the neat thing about it is actually designed to use aluminum instead of steel. It's a military-grade aluminum armor, so it will protect you from some stuff. I would not necessarily throw a large anti-tank round against it. It would not survive, anything that a main battle tank could. But it can be dropped out of an aircraft. They would not drop it out of the aircraft with the troops inside. They would actually have the tankers parachute in and collect the aircraft when it was on the tank on the ground. Now another thing is that this also doesn't use conventional munitions. It uses anti-tank missiles that are actually guided with a laser sight. So it's going to be able to pretty much put, as they say in the military sometimes, warheads on foreheads. So they're going to be able to guide the missile using that laser all the way to the target. It's also going to be used all the way from Vietnam through Desert Storm. And they were working on the replacement for this in the late 90s. But another thing about tanks is that tanks are often the first things to get cut when budget cuts happen. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of our tank programs and prototypes that we're working on to really fight the Soviets, because we're thinking, okay, a conflict may come, we need to be ready and have the best equipment. A lot of those new designs that we're working on, they actually are dropped. And the M8 tank, light tank is actually going to be one of those. But the neat thing about the Sheridan is that this actually has a split opinion amongst many tankers. There's those that like it, there are those that hate it. It really just depends on what your experience was personally with it. But one thing that they all did like is having just a nice big main gun. And it's actually designed to fire both missiles and high explosive shells. So that is another neat thing about it.
You can see some other differences here as well, like these tubes on the side of the turret, and then kind of a different look up top there. So how are some of those elements kind of different from some of the other tanks we've seen?
So the tubes you see, those are actually smoke launchers. So one thing to note about tanks is that it's not necessarily just the armor that protects you, it's also visibility. So if the enemy can't see you, if they can't locate your tank, you're technically safe because if you can see them but they can't see you, or you know where they are and they don't know where you are, you're more well protected than them. Because actually what they found in World War II is that oftentimes the first tank to shoot is actually the first tank to score a victory. He's more likely to win the engagement. So not being seen is just as good as not getting hit. It's actually better. And not getting hit is better than getting hit. And getting hit, that's really when you're hoping the armor works. So also on top, you can actually see some extra armor shielding. That's for the commander cupola. That's going to be if he's actually out of the turret, kind of getting a better view. So like I said, this is going to be used by cavalry units. And cavalry units' jobs are oftentimes scouting. So they're supposed to find where the enemy is, engage them if necessary, but really you want to make sure that they're as well protected as possible. That extra armor plating is going to allow the commander to look out in front of the tank rather than relying just on the sights that are inside the tank, using binoculars, being able to see it with his own eyes. And that actually goes back to US doctrine for tank commanders. The Russian doctrine nowadays, I believe, is still where they're buttoned up, they're down inside the turret. And a lot of tank commanders in the United States Army, they'll actually have the hatches open if it's applicable, if they're not in a scenario where someone could be shooting at them from above. They'll actually be able to poke their head out because it does provide you with a little bit of a better view. It's more quick and you're not obstructed in any way, shape, or form. So having that extra armor is actually going to help provide some protection from enemy rifle fire or shrapnel or artillery. So it's just a little extra measure. So say hello to the M60 Patton. This is the last one that's going to be named after Patton.
He got a lot of them though. Wow, that's a good run.
He did. He deserved it. He was in a sense our first tanker. So he actually is very important for tanks, and he's also very influential for the use of tanks. The M60 is kind of designed to be the better tank of the Soviet versus American tank designs. We actually design it to be as technologically advanced as possible. It's going to be introduced in the early 60s. I believe the first introduction was about 1959, 1960. And the neat thing about it is actually, I've seen some of the documents that are related to its development. One of the original plans was actually to have the first use of composite armor in the tanks for the M60. That would be where they would have the front plate here be steel, but also have a special type of material underneath the steel, and then another plate of steel behind it. They don't go with that type of armor because it's not quite ready for prime time yet. It's very brittle, so they're going to wait until they can perfect it in order to use it. But they do give it plenty of steel armor so it can survive a lot of the lighter anti-tank rounds the Soviets are using. It is not going to necessarily be protected from a new threat that tanks are now facing, and that's anti-tank missiles. And those will often be used by infantry or other vehicles, sometimes helicopters. So that actually creates an issue. The Israelis find this out the hard way during one of their conflicts, where a lot of their M60s and M48s are actually hit by anti-tank missiles. And so a lot of people ask nowadays with what's happening in Ukraine with the Russian tanks, is the tank dead as a concept? Is it useless? Is it obsolete? Well, the answer is no. They were actually asking this question back in the 70s because, again, those missiles were doing a number on just the armor of the M60s and M48s that we're supplying to Israel and Germany. But the answer is that the simple solution is combined arms. It's going to be actually where you're having infantry work with the tanks to provide protection from those anti-tank missiles. Another thing that we really implement is actually providing air cover. A lot of American divisions actually have a brigade that's devoted solely to aviation, and that's helicopters, attack helicopters and transport helicopters. So that's going to make it with those attack helicopters, such as the Apache, that they can provide protection for the tanks, because the Apaches, they'll have infrared sensors and cameras, and they'll be able to see the anti-tank crews or the vehicles that our tanks are going to be engaging. And that's going to make it so that we have more info, we know what we're going up against, and we're going to make it so that ways those missiles are not fired at our guys. Because the Apache, one of the concepts was actually that it would fire upon anti-tank teams using those anti-tank missiles. And actually a quick fact is the anti-tank missiles that the Israelis were coming up against, they were made by the Soviet Union, and they were literally just a wire-guided missile, as it would fly a small wire that was basically to control it from a joystick basically would come out the back. That missile system is actually still used nowadays by China. So we're actually, in a sense, going to be having the same solution that we came up with in the 80s. If, you know, we ever were in a war with someone using that type of missile, we would actually be using the same solution where we're going to have the helicopters provide some information and provide a little cover for the tanks. And meanwhile, you have infantry, guys on foot, soldiers with rifles. They oftentimes are going to have better visibility than the tankers, so they'll actually also be able to see threats before the tankers see them, and they'll point it out and the tank will deal with the threat typically.
It's a good reminder that all of these different kind of vehicles that we see here and a lot of what you see in the museum, it's designed to be used in tandem with a lot of different kind of warfighting elements. And so it's not like this was designed to just go on the battlefield by itself and win a war. There was part of a much larger strategy there, which is always kind of worth keeping in mind.
That's 100% correct. The Army functions on doctrine, and doctrine is never developed in a vacuum for any piece of equipment. It's always designed in regards to other pieces of equipment, other troops, other things. And that's one thing that we wanted to make sure with tanks, because we learned some lessons in World War II with the Sherman, for example. When we're using it in cities, for example, we're actually having the infantry walk in front of the Sherman. That sounds counterintuitive, but if there's enemy infantry hiding in the buildings and they have an anti-tank weapon, you don't want the tank to go first because they'll knock out the tank and then close off the road. So that's actually a similar practice to what we used during the Battle of Fallujah in 2004. American Marines, American soldiers, they actually walked in front of the tanks in order to provide better visibility and be, unfortunately, the ones who would get the first contact, but they're making sure that the tank, which can provide protection for the entire platoon or the entire company, it's going to be safe, because quite honestly, tankers and infantrymen, they always have a relationship that they take care of each other. It's symbiotic. It's going to make it so that both of them are able to get home at the end of the day. And the M60 is a perfect example of that, where actually the 1st Division uses M60s in Germany in the 1980s. We're supplied with the most advanced M60s at the time. The M60 actually has some upgrades to it when the Abrams comes around. That actually makes it slightly more advanced than the Abrams in some regards. Perfect example is it actually has a computer that takes the temperature of the gun barrel and actually measures it and tells how much is the barrel warping from firing. And then it's going to then put in those calculations so that you can be as accurate as possible. They then introduce that program into the Abrams, so that way the Abrams can have that same technology. The M60 also gets some upgrades. New turrets are, for example, this is actually a base model M60, so it has the standard round turret, but they will actually again reshape it so that way it would be a more angular design so it could survive anti-tank fire better. So the M60 is honestly, it's a very good tank, and actually it's still in use by a lot of countries nowadays, such as Turkey and Taiwan. So this is the M113. This is also not a tank. This is what's known as an armored personnel carrier. It's basically a battlefield taxi. It's designed to basically deliver the troops to the battlefield and then get out of there, because this is not going to necessarily have its own armament, but it is a very reliable vehicle. We do have some of these still in National Guard inventories, so it's a well-used vehicle. The neat thing about it is that it's also, it actually was used as NASA as a vehicle to transport the astronauts in case there was ever an emergency on the launch pads. So it's also aluminum armor. There is a paratrooper version, which is a lightened version that can be carried via a plane. It also carries about a little over a squad element of troops, so it's going to carry about 10 guys, about 11 typically maxed out. Now, a neat thing is we use these in Vietnam, the 1st Division, to transport troops around a lot. So when we're not using helicopters, we're going to be using these. The neat thing about these is that troops would actually customize them a lot. They'd add machine guns on top of them. I've seen accounts of some soldiers adding anti-personnel mines, such as the Claymore, on the outside of them, so that if they were ever surrounded by the enemy, they could hit the button and a bunch of pellets would go out and eliminate the problem. It's also going to be, it's capable of going through the water. It's amphibious, technically. So it's a very universal design. A lot of countries actually have upgraded these into light tanks in the last few decades. The Philippines, I believe, is one of them. They actually put a tank turret on top of this and use it as a light tank. Now, this is going to be the predecessor to the M2 Bradley, and the Bradley is going to be designed with a lot of lessons of this vehicle in mind. So they're going to have less troops in the Bradley, but they're going to have a turret that's going to have a nice big 25mm main gun as well as 2 tow missiles. So they're going to be working together at times and doing different jobs. But another neat thing about this vehicle is that you can have it do pretty much everything. It can be a command center, it can be an ambulance, it can get troops out, it can have a mortar installed in back so that you can provide indirect fire for the infantry. It can also carry anti-tank missiles. The United States developed an anti-tank missile system for this, and they called it the M901. It fired tow missiles, which are wire guided, so you control it with a joystick basically, and it was very effective. And in fact, a lot of other countries still have a lot of these in inventory. Now, I'll actually say a quick note to know about the tanks that we have in the tank park. We actually do not have anything that is of current standard issue. So the reason why we're allowed to have this is because I believe this is an M113A2, which means it is several models outdated. Right now, the most advanced one is the M113A6. So that means that no one's going to be able to come here and study all the specifications of it and be able to know, okay, here's the capabilities of this vehicle, here's how many men can fit inside, here's the horsepower of the engine. So it's going to be, that's actually going to be very important when I talk about the M1 Abrams in a second.
That's good to know for all the Russian spies that watch the videos, so that they can make note of that. This won't help them out very much.
Not very much.
Perfect. We'll go check out the last one then. Now we've come to the final vehicle in the tank timeline here at the museum. It's an iconic one that many people will recognize. So what can you tell us about this tank?
So this is the M1 Abrams. This is named after General Creighton Abrams, who was head of the Army in the middle and the early and middle 70s. So Abrams was actually a tanker in World War II. He was head of the 37th Tank Battalion, which became the 37th Armored Regiment. And the 37th Tank Battalion was part of the 4th Armored Division, which was one of Patton's famous divisions. The Abrams tank is considered the most advanced, most powerful main battle tank in the world. It is also the heaviest. It's going to weigh in at about 72 tons for the most up-to-date versions. This one right here, as I mentioned, we don't have the most modern versions of the tanks. This one right here is an Abrams, how it would be in the early 90s, because there's still a couple of Abrams that had 105mm main guns. Now, most of the Abrams were upgraded to the 120mm main gun. That's a German gun, actually, that we produce a licensed copy of. The 105 is actually a licensed copy of a British gun called the L7. So at this point, we actually have not designed our own tank guns in about 40 plus years. But there's a couple of new designs that the Army's been working on that they might arm the next version of the Abrams with, or another tank with. So another neat thing to know about the Abrams, it uses that composite armor I mentioned, but not the same type that we're using with, we were planning to use on the M60. We're actually going to use depleted uranium for the tank. So you don't need to worry, it's not radioactive, obviously. It's perfectly fine to touch and be around. I would not suggest trying to eat it because it would break a tooth.
I think that applies to any of the tanks, not
obviously,
just this.
yes, but uranium's just bad in general to try and eat. So that's why I make that joke. But anyways, the composite armor is also going to be much more effective than steel. The thickness of this armor, the compared thickness for a lot of estimates, which are not 100% accurate because unfortunately the armor is actually, fortunately the armor is still classified in how effective it is. But on the most modern version of the Abrams, it has a thickness of over 900mm of steel equivalent. So there's very few things that can actually go through that armor. Inside, for the composite armor, it's actually not going to be one solid block of anything. It's actually going to be a series of plates that are staggered in a diagonal pattern. So it's going to be designed to really take out heat shells, which are made to use that liquid metal. The plates, they're actually going to cause a lot of the molten metal to actually dissipate and spread around on the inside. You can actually also repair the armor a little more easily that way because you just take the broken plates out. When you're dealing with armor-piercing shells such as sabots actually don't do well when they're hitting multiple different things. So if there's a gap in between the armor plate, it actually causes it to shatter when it hits the next armor plate. So that actually makes it a very effective design. The Russians, when they actually don't use that type of armor for the hull of their tanks, but they do use that type of armor for the turrets. However, Russian tanks at the moment, they actually don't have as very thick armor compared to ours. Their tanks are actually about 20 to 30 tons lighter. And the reason why is that goes back to Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Russian dictator. He was not a fan of tanks, and he did not want heavy tanks around. So they had weight limits imposed on how heavy their tanks could be. So that determined how much armor they could have and how big their tanks could be. So they had to figure out how to have as much armor on as little a tank as possible. So they also developed explosive reactive armor. We do as well, but they develop it's a little bit of a different version. It uses a steel plate inside that actually would be designed to shoot out with the explosives to knock off a shell before it hits the main body of the armor. Neat thing about the Abrams is that it's a 1,500 horsepower gasoline turbine engine. It sounds like an aircraft a little bit when it starts up. It's also incredibly fast. It's going to go 45 miles per hour on the road, and it's very capable in off-road conditions. It is actually much quieter than a standard diesel engine on most tanks. So it actually gets the nickname Whispering Death because it's a quiet vehicle. It can run on multiple different types of fuels. It's called a multi-fuel engine. So one thing that it can even run on is kerosene. I bet you could probably figure out how to make it run on vegetable oil if you really try.
With enough creativity, anything's possible.
Enough creativity. Another neat thing about the Abrams is that it has a speed governor that keeps it at 45 miles per hour. There's some that think that it can go about 70 miles per hour, and there's some videos that supposedly someone removed the speed governor from them. It can move very fast, but you need that speed governor because otherwise you have a 70-ton vehicle moving at 70 miles per hour, and that's very hard to stop. There's actually never been an Abrams tank that was taken out by enemy fire. Only friendly fire has destroyed Abrams tanks.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is Abrams tanks in American service. When they're export models, I can't claim the same success rate. But another neat thing about it is that it uses a laser rangefinder. So it's actually able to basically point a laser pointer at something and get the range for how far it is. That feeds into a ballistic computer, which is going to calculate the angle that the gun needs to be elevated to. It's going to calculate all sorts of things such as weather, such as temperature, such as the air density. We have a couple of bases in the United States which are about a mile above sea level. You can hit targets at ranges of up to 2 miles at those bases because of the computer system in this tank. It's also got armored blast stores in the turret, so you're going to store all the ammunition back here. If the ammunition is hit, all the crew is going to be safe inside, so you're not going to have the same problem the Russian tanks have where the turret's blown off and the ammunition explodes. If the ammunition explodes in here, it's basically going to send all the explosive force up and out. So basically I've seen the video, you can find the video on YouTube of them testing this. You can just notice that you kind of notice because the blast door starts glowing a tiny bit behind it, but you definitely don't have the issue of the ammunition exploding and killing the crew. So that's actually what makes this one of the safest tanks in the world, because all the ammunition is stored in the turret and none is stored in the hull. And actually, where they would store the ammunition in the hull, they actually use for gas tanks so that they can store more fuel. So that way we can go about 300 miles on a single tank of gas for this thing.
Yeah, well that is so fascinating. I really appreciate you kind of giving us an overview of the whole collection here, taking us through the history of all of these different vehicles, and there's so many different interesting stories to tell. In addition to all of these tanks that are outdoors, the indoor exhibits at the museum are amazing as well. There's a Sherman tank in there, so if people were watching wondering where that was at, there's actually a Sherman tank in the museum as well. And for people who are traveling through the Chicago area, this is just a must-visit museum. It's free to get into, so you can't beat that. It's really an incredible experience. Thank you so much for taking the time to take us through all these.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and thank you so much for coming out. And honestly, it's great that you guys are helping to teach people history and provide a very fun way to learn about some of the museums that we have in our country. So
we're happy to do it. Thank you.